The Feast of Epiphany and the baptism of Jesus in the Eastern, or what even today we call the Orthodox Church, is their celebration of Christmas and the New Year. And actually the first 4 centuries, there wasn't a feast of Christmas in the Western Church. That was a later tradition. But it points out that Christianity developed for Gentiles and it developed out of the Jewish community. Christ, we know, was a Jew, and he came out of the Jewish tradition. We know the prophets and all the Old Testament. But Christ, when he preached, he said he was there for all men. And he told his disciples to go out to all the nations. And he went out to the Gentiles, but they didn't have the tradition of the Jews. They looked at things differently. And even in the time of the apostles, if you remember, there was a big argument that led to, if you remember, the first council that's written in the Acts of the Apostles, where they had to decide whether Gentiles would be held to the Jewish customs. Specifically, they were talking about circumcision. Should the males be circumcised if they were going to be Christians? And the apostles in this council decided that no, Jesus only required one thing: baptism, like the baptism he had. And so we see that the Jewish tradition kind of stuck in the Western Church. But in the Eastern Church, they had a different tradition, that they stuck more to what the words of Jesus were, not always harping back and depending on the Jewish law like they were following the Jews. No longer did the Gentiles see that they had to be held to dietary laws and all those things of Jewish tradition. And we see during the centuries, the words of Christ of building a church took on different traditions in the East and the West, and the theologies became different, and we see the arguments that occurred, the councils. We see the split of the East and the West around the 11th century. We come to the 15th century, the Reformation, and again, arguments, fights, everything on theology. I think Christ himself would be abhorred at seeing that his followers could not seek out unity. They would be fighting about little things and not worrying about his words of love one another, look out after each other, look out for the poor, the destitute, see that no one is in dire straits. His church was about people, not about buildings and constructs, but about loving each other. And that is what is an interesting thing to see today, that in all the dissension within the Christian world, there still is that spark that people want to follow his word. They would love to have that unity, but we have not yet learned how to work it out. But we must have the love, we must have the open mind, we must listen and wait for the Spirit to speak, to lead us to that moment when Christ will call us all together, whether it be in this world or eventually in the next world.